My name's Christy Sprague. I'm one of the weed scientists here at Michigan State University. Primarily what I look at is weed control in a lot of our agronomic crops, one of those crops being wheat. So one of the things that we've been doing over the last couple of years has really been trying to figure out, okay, we've got some of these newer weed problems that are showing up. How do we manage those? Let's look at some of the newer chemistries that are out there, some different timings, and over the last several years we've looked at a number of different projects, and we've really appreciated having the wheat checkoff program. The Michigan Wheat Program has really helped us be able to do a lot more stuff looking at some of the weed control challenges in wheat. What I'm going to talk about today, and I think you've got a handout in your bag talking a little bit about this, is one of the new weed species that we're seeing pop up a lot in wheat, and that's Roughstalk Bluegrass. And when we think about weed control in wheat, generally we've not worried too much about the grass weed species because they really haven't been that prevalent. You know, when we think about weed control, a lot of times we're trying to control things like common chickweed, things like henbit or dead nettle. You know, some of the early season weeds like common lamb's quarters. Those are really ones that we've focused on for a number of years, and we really haven't had a whole lot of issues with some of these grass weed species. But I would say probably over the last 10 years or so, we're starting to see more grasses come into wheat and become a problem. And one of the first grasses that we worked quite a bit on was common windgrass. And really where we saw common windgrass was kind of in the thumb region of Michigan. And there are a few good different chemistries that we can use to control common windgrass. And we've had very good success in controlling windgrass with things like PowerFlex and also Osprey. So those are probably kind of our go-to products to control that particular weed. And we've looked at a number of different timings with that particular weed, and we've looked at fall applications, early spring applications, as well as a little bit later. And one of the things that we found out, knew that was going to happen, was with windgrass, it primarily comes up in the fall. So if we planted sometime in September, the windgrass would come up about the same time as the wheat. We'd do a fall application once that wheat was about, had 2 tillers or so, and the windgrass was starting to come up. Generally, that was the majority of when the windgrass came up. We could control it with those fall applications and wouldn't have much problems with it in the spring. We also have done early spring applications, and those different herbicides have worked well. So we've kind of looked at some of these different grass weed species and trying to figure out the best way to control them. So that's with common windgrass. So I'm going to push this up here really quick and just kind of show you some of the different grasses that we're starting to see more and more of in Michigan. Okay. So one of the key things about common windgrass, which is this one over here, is right now you start to see it, and it's kind of got like a purplish tinge to it, and it almost looks like it's the seed heads are a little bit more fuzzy. And again, we primarily see this up in the thumb. So a lot of times Tuscola County, Sanilac County, Huron County, and that's some of the places where we've really started to see that particular weed. And we've got a really nice fact sheet in the back of the weed control guide, as well as on our website, msuweeds.com, that kind of outlines some of those control strategies. But more recently, what we're really starting to see is this weed right here, and this is what I'm going to primarily talk about today, and that's Roughstalk Bluegrass. So Roughstalk Bluegrass is actually a perennial grass species, and if you talk to any of the turf managers, any of the ones that are dealing with golf courses and stuff, they'll tell you that, hey, this is a huge problem in a lot of golf courses. And I thought, you know, I haven't really seen it too much, and I kind of like to golf a little bit. And last night I went golfing, and guess what? I looked down, I saw that weed. It was mowed, but it started to head out, just like what you see here in wheat. So it is primarily a turf weed, but we're really starting to see it a lot more in our wheat. A lot of times when we do see it is sometimes after following hay. That's one of the places where it's really starting to show up. And some of the key characteristics about this weed is we've done some work looking at when it comes up. We think about 85% of what emerges comes up in the fall, very similar to windgrass, but we do have some spring emergence. And over the last 2 years, we've done some work trying to look at some different herbicide strategies to manage this. A couple other key things I want to point out. It is a bluegrass species, so it has kind of what they think of as more of a keeled leaf shape, so it's kind of more of a almost a boat-like leaf shape. And then you have this membranous ligule that can also become jagged as it gets bigger. One of the key things that happens is once it starts to grow, usually about mid-May, we start to see it head out, and then right now we start to see it seed out, and then the seeds start to shed. So I've got some pots up here, so if people want to come up and take a quick look about it or look at it, this is just some of the windgrass that Roughstalk Bluegrass that has matured, and you'll see that pretty much we're starting that seed drop of that particular weed. One reason they call it Roughstalk Bluegrass is if you run your hands up and down that both the stem and also the leaves, it's a little bit rougher, so it's more jagged, and it can be a problem again in wheat. So last year we did a study and we looked at kind of when it emerged. We also looked at some fall applications. We looked at some early spring applications and some later applications of some different herbicides to see if we could manage it. When we looked at some of the fall applications, some of the products that we looked at were things like Osprey, PowerFlex. We looked at Axial XL. We also looked at some pre-emergence applications of Zidua, so pre-emergence prior to the Roughstalk Bluegrass coming up, since Zidua is technically labeled as kind of a delayed pre in wheat, and we wanted to see if that would hold through. When we looked at our fall applications, we actually had fairly good control, particularly with both PowerFlex and Osprey. We did some of the same types of applications in the spring. Early spring, we're looking at around the first part of May, when the Roughstalk Bluegrass was about 2 inches tall. Looked at, again, PowerFlex, Axial XL. We also looked at Osprey, and Osprey and the Axial XL looked the best, and this is from our results from this in 2018. We did some later applications about the time that Roughstalk Bluegrass started to seed out, and we really saw a decline in control, particularly with the PowerFlex. So kind of from our results from 2018, we saw that really Osprey and Axial XL were probably our kind of our better ones, especially from that early spring application. In looking at that, we took yields on a lot of these plots, and you wouldn't think that a grass weed like this could cause much yield damage. In our untreated plots that looked a lot like this, we had 50% reduction in yield by not controlling this weed. So we can see fields that have very heavy infestations, and that can be a huge problem. So we're trying to make people aware of this weed problem. This year, with kind of the more challenging fall, we planted a little bit later. We had an late October planting date, and had worked the ground prior to that. We were actually able to reduce the Roughstalk Bluegrass population by quite a bit because we took care of some of that earlier emergence. But in general, what we're going to see is we're going to need to have some sort of herbicide out there, particularly those early spring applications, to try to get control of Roughstalk Bluegrass. A couple other weeds I would like to mention. We are seeing a little bit more downy brome, or what people might call cheatgrass, in some of our wheat fields. Some of the key characteristics when it comes up, it kind of has, it almost looks like it starts to twist onto itself. It also is very kind of hairy, so it's kind of more of a fuzzy feel. It also has a membranous ligule that's jagged, and you can see over here what the seed head looks like. So it's a little bit more spread out And then also cheat is another weed that we can find in some of our wheat fields. So these are some of the grass weed problems that we do have. So I urge everybody, as you're driving around, taking a look at your wheat fields. A lot of times you're going to see these weeds above the wheat canopy. Start scouting, look at what your neighbors have, start thinking about, okay, in the next couple of years, are some of these grass weeds going to be a problem? And we do have some fairly decent control methods, and again, most of our methods really look at things like PowerFlex, Osprey, or Axial XL. There is a new product out called Axial Bold, which is a new pre-mixture, and it contains the same product as Axial XL, plus another grass product that is very similar to, that can be used in wheat, that is part of the same chemical family as something like Assure 2. So if you, as we kind of go through some of those different, if you look at that fact sheet, you'll see some of the different products that we use, what they're good on. And I would say that probably our two top grass products happen to be PowerFlex and Osprey if we're dealing with some of the key problems that we have in Michigan, like windgrass. Also, annual bluegrass is a problem, and you can see there's a lot of annual bluegrass behind us. That really is a challenge to control. Osprey and PowerFlex will do a pretty good job, but it has to be controlled prior to the seed heads coming out. Okay, so those are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. Let's see, what else do I have? We've also looked at these products in tank mixtures with things like Husky to control the broadleaf weeds. We've had some very good results with that, so we're able to control the broadleaves that are out there as well as some of the different grass species. So that's kind of what I have to say about some of the work we've been doing with some of the different grass species. And in particular, again, we're looking at trying to figure out the best way to manage this weed and trying to figure out probably how it's actually getting into some of our wheat fields, because again, by the time we harvest wheat, a lot of times that seed has shed, so it's going to be in that field. But where we're starting to see a lot of this pop up is after hay. So I'm going to direct everybody's attention up to that corner field right there. Okay? Oh, yes.
Is the per acre rate for Osprey the same in the fall as it would be in the spring?
Yes.
Osprey affect bluegrass in the fall too?
The annual bluegrass?
Yeah.
As long as it's all up, so it would be. So general, anything that any of those grasses that are up, it's going to do a pretty good job on. So, yep. So we've had that field over there. See that golden color? That's all Roughstock Bluegrass. Okay, so that's a hay field that's been in there probably about 4 years, and that's just some of the stuff that's being managed for the dairy. And you know, you can see how easily something like this can get out of control. And we really started seeing it around the state probably in the last 3-4 years. So as you drive by some of the wheat fields, you'll see wheat. A lot of it's, you know, nice green color, and you'll see this golden weed up top. That is going to be the Roughstock Bluegrass. A couple other key things I want to mention. This year again has been a challenge. There's a lot of wheat acres that probably did not have, I'm going to give up on that, have a herbicide put on it. You know, maybe some thinner wheat stands. So there are going to be some challenges with some of the weeds at harvest, maybe some lamb's quarters, ragweed, potentially mare's tail as an issue. We've done quite a bit of work with pre-harvest herbicide applications. With those pre-harvest applications, there is a section in the weed guide that talks about what can be used. One of the key concerns over the last couple of years has been the use of glyphosate, so that's probably not going to be recommended because of consumer needs. By far, that's probably one of our better options, but again, that's probably one you would have to check with who's taking your wheat on whether you can use that or not. The other options, Sharpen happens to be a pretty good one if you're trying to get control of things like mare's tail or common ragweed. So, and I'm not sure where we're at on time.
11:10 is when we're supposed to switch.
Okay, so I guess we have time for a few more questions. If anybody has any questions. Anybody seen any of these grass weeds popping up in their wheat? I know I've seen some downy brome up by Mount Pleasant recently, and then the Roughstalk Bluegrass showing up.
What's your theory? I mean, there's less than 80.
Yeah.
Less small dairies.
Yeah, and really, where it really first started showing up is in some of the areas where they're growing a lot of hay for the horse business, and they're, it's highly managed hay acres, and all of a sudden this weed's starting to show up, and nobody knows, if there was some contaminated seed or what, but it's even showing up in wheat acres that really don't have anything that's near, where there isn't any hay acres. So I'm really kind of struggling on trying to figure out where it's actually coming from. But I do know, where we've seen it on campus, a lot of it's come after hay. All right, so.
When's the best time to spray for mare's tail?
In what crop?
Wheat.
In wheat? Actually, I would probably say, because we're getting a lot of early spring emergence, probably in the spring. And probably our best options right now are things like Husky, because a lot of our mare's tail is ALS resistant, so the affinity broadspec wouldn't touch it. So.
What about a fall burn down prior to planting?
A fall burn down prior to planting. Sharpen could be used. So there is a label for Sharpen for use prior to planting wheat. That would do a good job. Again, most of our mare's tail or horseweed is Roundup resistant, so we do need to have something in there to control it. The other options that we have when we start thinking about what actually controls it is you start to think of the plant growth regulators like 2,4-D and dicamba. We get really concerned about getting those applications on and having those herbicides break down prior to planting the wheat, because we can see if we spray 2,4-D and plant wheat immediately, we will see some injury on that wheat. So Sharpen's probably our best bet from a fall burn down application.
For non-wheat ground, if you got a mare's tail infestation, would it be, is your preference fall spray to control or spring?
So for non-wheat ground, it's always good to have a fall application, but I will tell you, one of the challenges we do have is we're seeing mare's tail continue to come up through the season. So you can control what's there in the fall, but you're going to have to control what's coming up in the spring. And the ideally, and obviously it all comes to cost, is you try to control those ones that are in the fall, because those are the ones that are going to start to bolt in the spring and become harder to control compared to some of those ones that are coming up in the early spring.
2 applications.
2 applications. Yeah. When we've had some of the cooler falls like last year, we did not see a lot of mare's tail emergence in the fall. Most of it has come this spring. So if you had to choose between the two, I'd say hit it in the early spring. Early spring, get a residual out there so you can stop some of that later emergence. And we do have a few good fact sheets that are in the weed control guide that try to outline what are the best products, when are the best times to spray.